There is absolutely no reason why out on the street today a civilian should be carrying a loaded weapon.
The Constitution says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
You can turn back in time and you can say, right there is where the course of events change. As an emergency medicine physician, I've always been interested in looking upstream at the events that bring people through the doors in the emergency department. And I saw lots of firearm violence and was interested in the possibility of prevention. Second, I worked for a time early in my career in Cambodia, right after Pol Pot time. Refugee camp, we heard landmines going off, we heard gunfire. It was a very intense introduction to the power of violence to reshape an entire society. And I came home from Cambodia thinking, I have to do something about this. After I came back from Cambodia, I decided I'm going back to school in public health. I was interested in injury and violence prevention. So I went to Johns Hopkins to get public health training because that's where the injury and violence prevention people were. So I went back to school with the intention of at least working on injuries and violence. And while there, realized firearm violence was really the place to go because people weren't thinking about firearm violence collectively. They were thinking about suicide and homicide. But if you aggregated them, firearms were among the nation's leading causes of death. And there were fascinating research questions and important policy changes that needed to happen. Very few people were working on it. People told me this is academic suicide, you'll never get research funding, and they were right for a long time. We didn't, and there's organized opposition, and maybe it's risky. To be honest, for me, all of that was what's not to like. Here's a big problem that nobody's working on. I got it. I think the inciting research wasn't done by us. It was done by another research group which looked at the number, tried to strike a balance between deaths that everybody abhorred and deaths that maybe people think, well, there's maybe some justification to that. And what they found was that overwhelmingly, firearms were the sorts of deaths that we all would like to prevent. And that study was taken as threatening to the interests of the National Rifle Association, the interests of the firearm industry, which is engaged in selling a product. So a member of Congress by the name of Jay Dickey, who described himself, these are his words, as the point man for the NRA, caused language to be put into CDC's budget that said funding can't be used to advocate or promote gun control. That's an exact quote. Didn't say can't do research, it said what I said. But Congress also took out of CDC's budget the $2.5 million it was putting into research, and some of that was coming to us, gave it back to CDC for another purpose. Everybody saw the writing on the wall. CDC stopped funding research. We thought we were going to have to close our program down, but we didn't. And for almost 20 years, there was no federal health funding for research on firearm violence. There was justice funding, National Institute of Justice, but nothing from CDC or other health agencies. President Obama kept asking for funds for research. Congress wouldn't appropriate those funds. Agencies found them. But later, Congress appropriated money for research on firearm violence, and they've now stopped. Again, on average, over the last 10 years or so, we have gotten about $1 million a year in research, in funding for research on violence, most of that firearm violence. We're expecting most or all of that money to go away. And separately, in December, January, February, all of the new research announcements that we were planning to apply for were canceled.
Wow.
So we are headed back now into a time when there will be essentially no federal research on firearm violence. The problem's still there. We're just going to take our eyes off it again. The first research we did, we're in the early 1980s now. Very simple descriptive work. as it's called, just bean counting, really, to be honest. People had not done this work before. I was surprised to see how much more common firearm suicide was than firearm homicide. I knew about homicide. I knew about the concentration of homicide among young black men in particular. I wasn't prepared for the size of suicide. I was not prepared for, when you added suicide and homicide together, for the fact that even back in the 80s, we were experiencing almost as many deaths from firearm violence as we were from motor vehicle crashes. Now, think of all the time and effort we put into preventing motor vehicle crashes. We've redesigned the product, we've redesigned roads, we've taught people different ways to drive, etc. We've done essentially none of that, except for policy changes, for firearm violence. And that's still true. It's important for people to accept that first statement that you made, that guns are designed to kill. They're a tool. Put tools in people's hands and they'll use them. I mean, I'll say it absurdly. You can't kill somebody with a gun if you don't have a gun to kill them with. You can't kill yourself with a gun if you don't. But all of that accepted, it's still the case. And California, and I can show you an illustration of it, California, to my mind, has proven this, that it is possible to enact a suite of policies that affect the design of the product, how the product is bought and sold, who is able to have and use the product, and create some other limitations, and have a substantial continuing benefit on rates of firearm violence. I'll jump to the conclusion. California has done what I just described, and we can get into detail. But the upshot of it is this. When I started my work in the 1980s, California's rates of death from gun violence were higher than they were in the other 49 states, and tracked them very closely. Some things happened. We enacted a whole bunch of policies in a fairly short period of time. And in the last years of the 20th century, when rates of gun violence were declining in the other 49 states, they were plummeting in California, such that by 2000, the rate of firearm death in California was lower, not higher, than it was in the other 49 states. But the icing on the cake is what's happened since. Since 2000, in the other 49 states, the death rate from firearm violence, and I include both suicide and homicide here, the death rate from firearm violence has been trending upward. In California, it's been trending downward because I would argue of the continuing effects of those policies, such that in 2023, which is the most recent year for which we have data, the firearm violence death rate in the other 49 states on average is almost 80% higher than it is in California.
Andre, Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband were both shot and killed inside their home on Saturday.
We are today still dealing with a real threat of political violence in the United States.
Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro praised state police Sunday after troopers helped him and his family escape a fire in their residence. The suspect, 38-year-old Cody Ballmer, initially fled, then later surrendered to police.
Tyler Robinson, accused of gunning down Charlie Kirk, appearing in a Utah courtroom via video link for the first time since his arrest.
So let's talk about January 6th. Nobody has talked about the fact that that mob, whatever you want to call them, that large group of people, was, with a few exceptions, unarmed, because DC prohibits carrying. The fact that January 6th did not result in the overthrow of the elected government of the United States, to my mind, is the single most important victory for gun policy in the United States in its entire history.